Welcome to this Export Orientation Awareness Program brought to you by Seda, the Small Enterprise Development Agency, an agency of the Department of Small Business Development. I trust and hope that the information that you will receive will be beneficial to you and your organization. The topics that we will cover under the learning map will look at how to register as an exporter, international supply chain management. Will define who and what a freight forwarder is and what role they play and the services they offer during this global transaction. We look at the different stages at the export or trade cycle, define Incoterms and trade compliance. We look at the different measures and compliance bodies and how they play a role in the application for export permits. We look at the different modes of international transport and how you can go about making a decision when it comes to choosing which way you can transport your goods. We look at international trade documentation that is required during the shipment of the goods. We will recap and end the session. To register as an exporter, you have to understand that the export of some goods is restricted, and the reason for this restriction or the control of these goods is to support beneficiation strategies. And these strategies are strategies to convert raw materials or minerals to high value products. They are also restricted to assist local manufacturers to make sure that they are able to have access to raw materials before they are exported. An export is also there to make sure that you comply with applicable export control measures, because before you obtain a permit, you have to apply and get authorization to export that particular good or product. An export is also there to ensure that certain individuals or organizations comply with the provision of international agreements. So the importing countries will have laws, regulations when it comes to goods that must enter into a country. So the permit is there to ensure that some requirements of the importing country is also complied with, as well as the country where the goods are going to be exported from. So this is to make sure that all requirements when it comes to international laws and regulations and standards, as well as the country where the goods are manufactured, are adhered to. Then export permits also assist to control the outflow of goods so that scarce resources or the resources that we do not have much of are not exported without having a control measure or regulating those goods. The policy that applies to the export of goods, they will differ from sector to sector, and you have to ensure that you comply with the requirements of the respective sector. A simple international supply chain model can best be represented by three trade and business processes, namely the buying or the selling of the goods that are going to be exported, the shipment details, how are they going to be shipped, as well as the payment terms. So let's look at a number of activities that are involved in the supply chain model. Firstly, you need to identify the potential trading partner. Who are you going to trade with? And then you will then establish the business agreement that you are going to enter into. So once you have identified who you're going to trade with, you need then to decide and define what the expectation is in terms of delivery, the quantities that are going to be ordered, and any other requirement that must be part of the sales contract that is going to be binding to both parties. Then the last activity that deals with the buying or selling of goods is the actual ordering of goods, how much of the goods needs to be delivered. Then we look at the next process, which is the shipment of goods. This is quite complex because it involves a number of foreign currencies, different policies between both countries, as well as different laws which the importer and the exporter need to know and understand, and make sure that all documentation that is required meets the requirements of both parties. Then lastly is the payment arrangement. So there needs to be arrangements that are made between both parties with the help of the different banking institutions. Then it is also important to understand that in this process, there are a number of stakeholders that are involved. You have a customer, you have suppliers, you have authorities, you have freight forwarders, and any other service providers that might be part of this process. So it's also important that all of these parties or the stakeholders work together to achieve the goal of delivering the goods on time, at the right place, to the right person, in the right condition. Let's look at a freight forwarder, who they are and what their role is. So, by definition, a freight forwarder is a person or a company that organizes shipments for individuals or corporations to get goods from the manufacturer or the producer of the goods to a market, customer, or the final point of distribution. Traditionally, their role was to play as an agent and facilitate the various parties that are involved in the importing or the exporting of goods. So they would facilitate activities between the importer, the exporter, carriers, port authorities, customs officials, and so forth. The freight forwarder's function has been to handle the logistics chain, with focus being on finding the most cost-effective way of moving a consignment of goods to its place of destination in the shortest possible time. So their role was to ensure that they find cost-saving ways that will make sure that the goods are delivered in the shortest or best possible time. So, in short, one could say their role was to move goods out of the country on behalf of the exporters or shippers, or move goods into the country on behalf of importers. However, their role has now evolved. They are now doing more than just facilitating the transportation of goods. They now offer advice to customers on the most appropriate mode of transport for a given consignment. They also advise on the choice of the most suitable carrier, in terms of also ensuring that the necessary costs that are attached to that mode of transport is known and adhered to. They assist in preparing transport documentation. They also ensure that cargo compliance is applicable in accordance with the statutory requirements and the relevant letters of credit. And the letter of credit is part of the payment agreement between the importer and the exporter. They assist in port clearance requirements to make sure that costs like port cargo dues are correctly calculated and paid. They offer advice on packaging and marking of the goods, as well as supervise the movement of the relevant goods of concern. However, the choice of the freight forwarder that you use must be influenced by the following. You must choose the freight forwarder based on their extent of geographical coverage, in terms of if they can be able to assist you in delivering the consignment anywhere in the world. Do they specialize in one or a number of different regions? So, in other words, do they have detailed understanding of the geographical part of the transaction? Do they have knowledge of the relevant transport industry? Do they understand the clearing services and requirements that they should offer? And when you are making a decision on the freight forwarder, you could also visit the South African Association of Freight Forwarders website, who will be able to supply you with a list of their member of organizations which subscribe to the association's standards trading conditions, who would have sufficient liability insurance to meet their obligations under the conditions, and they would have committed to the code of the association. So you would know that you are dealing with a legitimate freight forwarder. It is also important, or it's recommended, that you also visit their premises to make sure that they run um, professional and viable operations. In other words, they run legitimate businesses. Let's look at a brief overview of the export or the trade cycle. So there are three distinct stages, where it's a sales contract, delivery of goods, and securing of payment. So under the sales contract, before the contract is signed, the importer and the exporter will negotiate the terms of the contract, the requirements, the goods, the details of the goods, the transportation that is required, and all other information that may be necessary for both parties. It is the responsibility of the importer to make the exporter aware of any statutory requirements, whether there are laws that are governing or managing the importing of goods, or if there are regulations that the exporter must comply with. Then, once all of that information is detailed, the exporter must then prepare the cargo for transit in terms of the contract. So now they must prepare the goods that are going to be exported. The exporter must also make sure that the goods and the documents will meet the requirements of the customs. So the customs is the authority that is in a country who is responsible for collecting tariffs and controlling the flow of goods into and out of a country. So tariffs are charges that are charged when it comes to goods that are being imported or exported. So the exporter can also decide to use the services of a freight forwarder. We will look into who and what the roles of the freight forwarder are in the following slides. So the exporter must also then look into the modes of delivery of the goods as the next stage. So the exporter must then decide or make a decision with regards to the type of transport that will be utilized so that the goods will reach the importer's country in a good condition. The other stage that we look at is the securing of payment. This is where now the exporter secures payment for the exported goods from the importer. So the importer will now pay the exporter as per the sales contract. So briefly, that is the export cycle. We will now, into the following slide, look at the details of what is contained in the cycle. Let's look at a typical export cycle. At the center of the cycle, you have the sales contract. The sales contract is between the importer and the exporter once they have agreed and negotiated the terms of the contract. The terms will include the goods that are going to be delivered, the quantity, as well as the price and any other requirement that both parties see are important for this transaction. Then, once the sales contract has been signed, the delivery process begins. The exporter would have prepared, manufactured the goods, and gotten the necessary required documents so that they can produce at customs. Customs are the authorities or the officials that will authorize goods to leave or enter into a particular country. So the exporter has to make sure that they meet the requirements of the customs official in their country before the goods leave the country, as well as meet the requirements or regulations of the import customs, who will also check, verify the documents before the goods enter into the country. However, if there are any incomplete or inaccurate documents that are submitted, there could be expensive penalties, the goods can be confiscated, or the goods can be returned to the exporter's country at the expense of the exporter if the importing country does not accept the inaccurate or incomplete documents. So it is important that the exporter complies with the export requirements as well as the import requirements or regulations of the importing country. Then when it comes to the payment terms, which would have also been part of the sales contract, a number of banks could be involved, the importer's banks as well as the exporter's bank. So the exporter will then prepare transport documents as well as any other necessary documents, and they will give to their bank that they are working with. Then the bank that the exporter is working with will then transfer the documents to the importer's banks. And once the importer has paid for the goods and the documents, then the importer's bank will give the importer the documents of the goods, then forward the payment back to the exporter. So that is how an export cycle works. And all of these requirements in terms of the delivery, the price, and the payment plan are part of the sales contract. This process can involve up to 12 different parties, including customs authorities, brokers, freight forwarders, insurance, independent quality inspectors, as well as banks. The roles in the trade cycle are best explained by looking at international commercial terms, which in short are called Incoterms. These are internationally recognized by governments, by legal authorities, and practitioners that are involved in global or international trade. The scope of these terms is limited to the rights and obligations of the parties that are involved in the delivery of goods as per the sales contract. So now these Incoterms, they serve as a common language where both parties can understand what their expectation is with regard to the exporting or importing transaction. Remember, the importer and the exporter may have different languages which can create misunderstandings. So the Incoterms are there to ensure that both parties know and understand what their expectation is with regards to the contract. Now, the seller and the buyer's responsibilities are as follows briefly. The exporter is responsible to make sure that they supply the goods or the cargo in the complete form. In other words, it must meet the requirements of the importer, including the packaging requirements, the labeling, and transportation requirements until the goods are delivered at the place where both parties have agreed upon. And the importer has a responsibility to make sure that they pay and receive the goods at the place where both parties have agreed upon. Looking at the trade cycles, there are deadlines which need to be adhered to. If the deadlines are not met, there are consequences that can be met. Some of the consequences could mean that the goods are time sensitive. In other words, if you look at exporting bananas, for an example, if a deadline to export or to transport the banana is missed, the bananas may be rotten and be delivered in a poor quality. Then the other consequence that we could have is paying additional costs when it comes to storage or having to prepare additional paperwork because the deadline for delivery or transportation has been missed. Now, if you look at Incoterms, they are focused on cost. They indicate who is responsible for the expenses that are involved in a shipment at a given point in time during this shipment journey. They also look at control in terms of who owns the goods at which given point in the journey. And lastly, they talk to liability. Who is responsible for paying damage to goods at a given point in time during the shipment or the exporting? So it is also important that the seller and the buyer, in assistance or the understanding of the Incoterms, arrange insurance on the goods while it is in their legal possession. This is to ensure that you reduce or you don't have time wasted, any lawsuits or relationships that could be broken down because of not complying to the sales contract agreements. Now we look at Incoterms. Incoterms is an abbreviation of International Commercial Terms. These are terms that are used during an international global transaction or trade transaction. There is a set of rules which define the roles and responsibility of the seller and the buyers. The seller is also sometimes known as an exporter, and the buyer is sometimes known as an importer. These terms are published by the International Chamber of Commerce, and they are there to assist in reducing misunderstandings that may take place between the traders. So they help to reduce or minimize any disputes or misunderstandings. They are effective also to use when there are court cases, so they are effective in settling those disputes. They also assist or provide information on the location when it comes to the physical movement of goods from the exporter's premises right up to the importer's premises. So the different locations will be indicated, and the role and responsibility of the importer and the exporter will also be indicated at those points. They also share or assist in sharing the risk, the transportation costs, and the responsibilities associated with the delivery of goods. So they will also assist or provide information on the modern day transportation practices when it comes to the transportation of goods from one country to the other. Incoterms help us to define the physical location or the physical movement of the goods from the seller right up until the importer. And if you look at the image indicates or shows us the seller's responsibilities or the obligations with the transfer of risk that is indicated by the dot on the image right up until the goods have reached the importer. So when an Incoterm is used during the movement of goods, the place must also be indicated. For example, if goods are being shipped by air, then the airport or the point or the place must be indicated with the name, for example, OR Tambo. That a point is where there is a transfer of cost, a transfer of risk, or a transfer of responsibility. Now let's look at some of the obligations as guided or defined by the Incoterms. We firstly look at the seller's obligation. The seller, who is also the exporter, has the responsibility to supply the correct quantity, correct quality, and value of goods according to the requirements of the importer. They must also supply the goods before the stipulated delivery time or on the expected time of delivery. They must prepare, manufacture the goods, and pack them in the packaging that is being specified by the importer or the buyer. And the mode of the packaging that is used must be able to be protected or to withstand the mode of transport that is going to be used. So the packaging must be able to be used and protect the goods while it is being transported. The seller must also make sure that they provide a commercial invoice and a packing list to the buyer, as well as any certificates of origin that will be required by the importer in their country so they can be able to collect or receive the goods that are being imported. Then, when you look at the buyer's obligations, the buyer has the responsibility to accept all risks or any loss or damage to the goods once they take the goods from the place of delivery, which was agreed upon with the seller. Then, if they fail to pick up or collect goods at the specified time, then they must be willing or they are liable or responsible to pay any additional costs by not picking up goods on time. Then they must also provide the delivery form or the delivery note to the seller to confirm that the goods have been delivered according to the agreements. The buyer and the seller must note the importance of communication because they must be able to notify each other when the goods are expected to be delivered or when the goods are expected to be shipped or exported. Then we look at the freight forwarders' roles or their responsibility. They have the responsibility to exercise their degree of skill and knowledge and care when it comes to them performing their duties. So they must be able to show their competence when they are offering their services. Some freight forwarders also comply to ISO standard 9002 of 1994. And some customers, they specify that they want the freight forwarder to comply with this particular standard of logistics service contracts. The freight forwarder is also expected to be able to deliver the goods in time, failing which they must be able to inform the customer if they are experiencing any challenges with the movement of the goods or any goods have been damaged. They must also make sure that they are able to take and execute or implement the principal customer's instructions. The freight forwarder must be able to select the proper carrier and any other service provider that may be required during the transaction. And they must be also able to offer advice on insurance and when insurance and what type of insurance is ideal or is good for this particular transaction. Then lastly, we look at the customs authorities. They must make sure that the goods that are coming into the country are not going to affect the country, the people that are staying in the country, or the environment of the country. And they must also make sure that all customs duty that are expected to be paid on goods are collected according to the expectation. They must also be able to keep records of the type of goods and the number of goods that have entered or left the country to the origins and the destinations of these goods. And this information or the records that they keep are used for import and export statistics that are required for a particular country. If your organization is looking at exporting goods from South Africa, it's important to understand the trade environment, including the relevant compliance bodies and their requirements and control measures that are in place. We will look at these later on in the session. However, it's also good to note that support, guidance, and advice is offered from these bodies and certain organizations, including Seda, as well as professional consultants that you may consult. All countries, including South Africa, control their imports and their exports. Imports are goods that are coming into a country, and exports are goods that are leaving a country. Even though countries promote and support export, there are control measures in place, and these are mainly used to prevent certain persons and unfriendly countries from getting certain products, or preventing that the scarce resources of a country run out. Now, these controls are done by using a number of documentation processes. And if you look at import controls, they will differ from one country to the other because each country has its own policies, laws, regulations, and business practices that may or may not support import. Regulations are also based from product to product. Now, if you look at these import controls, certain countries have free restrictions like Hong Kong and Singapore. Certain countries like USA and more industrialized countries, they have open markets. However, if you look at the less developed countries, they tend to have higher import duties and restrictive non-tariff barriers. And these restrictive non-tariff barriers include import quotas. So it's not only import duty costs or fees, it's import quotas, which limit the quantity of certain goods that can be imported into a country. There's also licensing, which will require permits for goods to be imported, as well as exchange controls, which limit the number of foreign currency or foreign money that is entering a particular country. It is also important to note that with international trade, the importer will require that the shipment be pre-inspected to ensure that the goods that are received are in good condition. They eliminate the risk, they eliminate delays with early detection of any deviations in terms of the sales contract that was signed. They save expenses as well as protect their interests. So this forms part of the sales contract and it's maybe part of the payment requirement. When there's importing that has to do with a country, pre-inspection is mandatory. So the goods need to get a clean report before the goods enter the country. And a country or a government will do this to safeguard their national financial interests. In other words, to prevent that the uncertainty and rapid movement of large sums of money out of the country, as well as fraud when it comes to evading or running away from paying customs duties. There are a number of compliance bodies and measures in place when it comes to exporting and importing. However, not all of them will apply to each and every exporter. Each body will apply to the exporter depending on the type of product that you are going to export. Also note that each body or the department will have its own internal processes that you will have to follow during the application for the permit, as well as documents that they will require when it comes to the application. So other information that you can get information from government notices, gazettes, and schedules which speak to exporting, because the information shared here is not to make you an export expert, but to create an overview on the different bodies as well as the processes or requirements when it comes to becoming an exporter. We firstly look at the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition. They offer incentive schemes. These are programs or support services or resources that support exporters. And when you are looking at trading with strategic commodities like chemicals, ammunition, military equipment, then you will be expected to provide an import certificate with your export application that will indicate that the importing country is aware of the process and the transaction or the global trade. Then we look at the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. They offer export certificates when you are looking at trading with products like your wine. And if you are trading in certain goods, you will require special permits. And those goods, for example, are live animals, meat, certain fish, dairy products, fruits, vegetables, tobacco, and other products. Then when we look at the Department of Energy, they offer or they are responsible for export permit applications when it comes to refined products. And these products, for example, are your diesel, your oil products, your petroleum products, and the actual certificate is produced by the Internal Trade Admission Commission, and the Department of Energy recommends the application. Then when it comes to the Department of Health, they are responsible for food import and export inspections as well as certification to ensure food safety. There are a number of role players. They also have different responsibilities and activities within the process. So you will find your health authorities, your certifying officers, your Department of Agriculture that also play a part when it comes to food safety. Then your South African wine industry systems, they deal with applications when it comes to products like your wine or your maize products. Then the South African Revenue Services and Customs, you have to register with them if you are looking at becoming an exporter. Then you will be issued with a customs code number that you will utilize during your transactions. Then when it comes to commercial banks and the South African Revenue Service Bank, this as part of an export, if you are exporting goods or value of more than 50,000, you have to complete a declaration form. This form needs to be authorized and stamped before you are actually allowed to export the goods. So this document or this form will be required at customs for clearance. So the commercial bank is the one that will process the transactions and channel the documents to the South African Reserve Bank. A commercial bank is a bank that deals with public and companies. Then lastly, we look at customs and excise. They check a number of documents, including following other processes when it comes to checking documents for the consignments that are going to be leaving the country. These documents need to be accurate and they keep them for a period of 5 years in case there are any audit inspections. So these are just an overview of the compliance bodies that you will need to familiarize yourself with the requirements based on the products that you are looking at exporting. Non-compliance with the export measures and the requirements of the different bodies could possibly lead to your goods being impounded or confiscated or held up. You could also be expected to pay any fees or penalties if you do not meet or comply with the requirements of these bodies. It's also important for you as a potential trader to understand South Africa's trading environment. South Africa's trade relationship is different from country to country, so it will trade more heavily with other countries as compared to other countries. South Africa has export and import partners, which your knowledge thereof, so if you know who these are, it could make it easier for you to identify a potential trading partner where already relationships or partnerships have been formed. South Africa also has dominant export and import items. The top export items are gold, diamond, platinum, machinery and equipment, coal, motor vehicles and parts, and the top 5 import items are machinery, transport equipment, chemicals, petroleum products, textiles, and scientific equipment. So it is important for you as a potential trader to ensure that you comply with all the requirements so you don't have any consequences and you understand South Africa's environment, which could assist you in identifying potential partners and being able to provide yourself with support when it comes to exporting requirements. International shipping or freighting includes any method of transport, and in some instances, the goods can be transported in more than one way. For example, if the goods are going to be transported by air, they would have been transported by road before they get to the airport for them to be exported. There are various modes of transport, so goods can be transported by rail, by road, by air, or by sea. However, deciding on the choice is influenced by a number of factors. We firstly look at cost. The size of the consignment of goods that are transported and the weight have an influence on cost. The other cost factors you need to consider are the cost of loading the cargo into a container, the cost of obtaining the necessary documentation based on the mode of transport that will be checked by authorities at relevant points during the shipment. You need to consider all freight costs, applicable import duties when it comes to the mode of transport you are using, as well as insurance costs. Remember, the choice of transport for you as an exporter, you want to be able to make sure you are able to deliver on time in the best or cost effective manner. Your choice will also be dependent on the timing issues. What type of goods are you transporting? Is it fragile goods that could be damaged during transportation if it is transported over a long distance? Whether the goods are perishable, goods that have got expiry dates. You also need to look at the advantages and disadvantages of each mode of transport before you make a decision. Firstly, we look at transporting goods by road. These are also subclassified. However, when you look at the overland trucking way of transporting goods, by far this is a cheap option, especially if you need to travel short distances. But the goods that you need to transport using this way is goods that are not sensitive to time. The subclassifications include full truck loading or less truck loading. So it will depend on the number or the quantity of the goods that you are transporting. Then when you look at rail, in South Africa, rail is specifically used to transport bulk commodities like your manganese or your coal. Then when you look at transporting goods by air, this is very fast. However, it could be pricey. However, one of the benefits is you have controlled cargo space as well as the ability to transport oversized goods. Then when you look at transporting goods by sea, this is also good because you are able to transport large shipments. However, the consignment or the product must not be time sensitive. Sea travel also has subclassifications. You could transport by using less container loads or full container loads, depending on your packaging as well as the type of goods that you are using. Containers are also an important part when it comes to international shipments. Introducing containers has helped in handling cargo or handling goods efficiently when it comes to loading, as well as lowering costs. The other benefit of using container is the fact that they come in different forms and shapes for goods to be able to carried in. Your choice of the best transport mode comes after careful consideration, because if you get the decision wrong, it can cost you time, money, or even a client as well as your company's reputation. The following seaports are owned and managed by the Transnet Port Authority, and this port authority is the largest in the African continent. Each port has its own commodities or basic goods that it usually imports or exports. They are each affected by different weather conditions based on where they are located. Commercial ports play a big role in South Africa's transport, logistics, and socio-economic development, and each offer unique services to the respective port. So Durban will have services that are not the same as services that are offered by the East London port, for example. About 98% of South Africa's exports are conveyed by sea. And should you require any information or support in terms of any challenges you might experience when utilizing a port, there is a national ports regulator that was established in 2005, and they are responsible for the economic regulation of the port systems. So they must monitor the activities of the Transnet Port Authority. They must promote regulated competition, investigate and handle complaints as well as appeals. Now let's go over some of the characteristics of the different ports. Durban is the busiest in the African continent and is biggest also in terms of container capacity. So in other words, they are able to handle a large number of containers on their harbor. The Richards Bay port has a good strength in deep water infrastructure. In other words, they are able to handle port operations that cater for deep water operations. And the terminal also allows for high speed, high volume cargo handling, and they have a fast turnaround of vessels. East London is situated between Durban and Port Elizabeth at the mouth of the Buffalo River. It is the gateway to border-Kai areas, southern and central countries, and it also has excellent rail capabilities. Then when you look at the Port Elizabeth Harbour, it is situated in Algoa Bay, midway between Durban and Cape Town. Then Mossel Bay is situated between Cape Town and Port Elizabeth. It is the only port in South Africa that operates two offshore mooring ports within port limits. Then Cape Town is situated 120 nautical miles northwest of the Cape Agulhas and has developed into one of South Africa's most important links to foreign trade. Then lastly, we look at Saldanha Bay. It is situated on the west coast of Africa. It is the deepest and largest natural port in South Africa and is protected by artificial breakwater and is the only port that deals with iron ore. So you will also then look at the different ports, the services that it offers, and the goods that you are looking at importing and exporting, and then make an informed decision on which port to utilize for your global transactions. During an international trade, there are certain documents or documentation that is required. The document is required to set up the export transaction between the importer and the exporter. Remember, the importer is sometimes known as a buyer or a consignee, and the exporter is sometimes known as a seller or a shipper. The documentation is also required for export customs clearance, where the exporter is expected to produce documentation that will be checked, verified, and authorized by the customs official, who will authorize that the goods can leave the country. In the same way that the importer will require documentation to produce at their customs for the customs official to check, verify, and authorize that the goods can enter into the country of destination. Now let's look at some of the main documents that are part of this international transaction. Firstly, we look at the pro forma invoice. This is similar to a commercial invoice. It's only that on the document, the name is clearly stated as a pro forma invoice. However, there are two uses to this document. Firstly, it is used as a negotiating instrument between the importer and the exporter. So if the negotiations did not take place thoroughly and in detail, then the pro forma can be used for such a function. The document can also be used as a quotation document. Then the next document we look at is a packaging list. This has the detail of the goods that are going to be shipped, the details of the exporter, the contact details of the exporter, and including the physical address, as well as the details of the importer and their reference number. It also details the packaging and the type of carrier that is going to be used for this transaction. It also details the content of the particular consignment. Then we look at an exchange control form. South Africa is amongst the few other countries that still use this form. This form is used to regulate or control the movement of foreign currency in and out of the country. So foreign currency is money that is used by other countries. This document must be signed before the goods are exported out of the country, because this document is going to be required for customs clearance so that the customs official can authorize and approve. Then the next document we look at is the bill of lading. This document is issued or given by the shipping agency that is responsible for shipping goods on behalf of the exporter. These documents are provided either in twos or threes. However, each copy must be accounted for, because if the copy lands in unauthorized or the wrong hands, then that person can have control and possession of the goods. So it is important that once these documents are issued, they are clearly numbered and each copy is accounted for to protect the goods that are being transported. Then we look at an airway bill. This document makes sure that the goods have been received for shipment by air. It also has the details of the sender and the receiver, who is the shipper or the consignee, the details of the airport that will be used for the goods to be exported from. It will have the detail of the markings, as well as being signed and dated. This document will also indicate if all freight costs have been paid or they will be paid at destination. Then the next document we look at is a roadway bill. This is another form of lading, and it is used in South Africa. This document serves as proof that the goods can be transported by road. It also indicates the details of the importer and the exporter, whether the full freight cost has been paid. It also provides a guide on how the goods must be handled, dispatched, and delivered. It is also a means of clearing goods through customs. So it will be used for the documents or for the goods to be cleared at customs. Then we look at the rail bill of lading. So when it comes to transporting bulk cargo by rail, the documents that are applicable is the spoornet combined consignment note, the truck label, and a spoornet freight transit order. This document needs to be stamped by customs when goods are transported between neighboring countries. Then we look at a container terminal order document. This document is used when goods are transported by rail between an inland container terminal and a portnet container terminal. It serves as a transport instruction or a shipping instruction or a combination of the two. Then we look at a certificate of origin. This document is required by customs authorities of the importing country. So the country that will receive goods will require this document so that they can impose import duty fees. Then we look at an insurance certificate, which is also known as an insurance policy. This certifies or indicates that the goods that are being transported have been insured. They will have the details of the goods that are going to be covered in terms of insurance. It will indicate the value of the insurance. It will also have any other information that is necessary for coverage to take place. The date on this certificate must be on the same or earlier date as on the issuance of transport documents to make sure that the goods are covered before they are actually transported. Then we look at the cargo dues order form. This indicates the fee that is charged by the Transnet National Port Authority for the utilization of their facilities. So these fees are paid both by the exporter and the importer. The detail of these fees is indicated every April by the Transnet Authority. So it's important that you keep yourself up to date with regards to the latest fee costs. Then the other document we look at is the delivery note. This document goes hand in hand with the shipment and it has the details of the goods that are being delivered, as well as the grade, the quantity of goods that are being delivered, and it needs to be signed by the buyer and sent back to the exporter as proof that the goods have been delivered. Then the second to last document that we look at is the carriage and insurance paid document, which is the CIP. This document indicates who owns the document at what stage during the transportation process. It also indicates who is responsible exactly for what during this transaction. This document is aligned to the sales contract which was signed between the importer and the exporter and is also aligned to the Incoterms as we previously described or defined. Then the last document that we look at is the banker's letter of credit. This letter has to do with whether credit can be given to either the importer or the exporter. So the performance of previous accounts is monitored to check the credit profile of the potential customer. So it is important that as a potential importer or an exporter, you ensure that you have a healthy credit profile, as it will have an impact on whether banks can give you credit. Alternatively, this will also indicate whether payment will be made when the goods are delivered, or you could be offered advanced credit before the goods are delivered. So this letter also has an expiry date, so you need to ensure that whatever the requirements in terms of the sales contract are within the timelines as indicated, so that you do not incur any consequences of missed delivery times. We have looked at a number of topics, namely We've defined what a freight forwarder is. We've looked at what an export cycle is and the processes or the steps that are contained therein. Now let's look at document confidentiality when it comes to export transactions. So confidentiality, if defined, it is keeping employee, customer, and client information safe so that the company is not implicated should any of the information be accessible to third parties or unauthorized persons. So, in other words, the company needs to have a way of controlling or managing the confidential information that it has in their possession so it is not sued if the information is leaked or is accessed for fraudulent activities. So, document confidentiality must be maintained at all times. This can be done by having a lock and key where the documents are locked or having registers where access to the information is controlled. So a person will indicate what the documents they require and for what particular reason. So it's important that the company must also understand that having client information, it's like having inside info when you have competitive intelligence when it comes to what the customer activities and behaviors are in comparison to your competitors. Loss of confidentiality can have a negative impact, especially to parties that are involved in the supply chain. Say, for example, the freight forwarder that you are using leaks or shares the information of your international transaction with a competitor. Because remember, when you are doing business with the freight forwarder, it means they have the details of the sales contract. They have the details of the price that you are charging for your goods. They have the details of how you are going to be transporting the goods. So they have all the means of how the business transaction is going to take place. And if that information is shared with your competitor, you could then end up losing business and you will not benefit from your efforts in finding an international partner with regards to trading. So it is important that confidentiality is maintained because even for the freight forwarder, should that happen, they could lose business or you could sue them for exposing your company information to an external party or your competitor. Document confidentiality is also important because it must protect or it protects the company's trade secrets. Because if that happens, then your competitors or external people can have the information of how you do business or how you manufacture the products that you are manufacturing. So it is important that you keep these safe. Alternatively, if not, then the company could lose business, you could lose revenue, and the company could close down and your employees have to be retrenched. So it is important that the trade secrets are kept confidential and protected. Then the company must also have or maintain ethical standards when it comes to private information that it has of its company, of its employees, as well as the clients. So the company can have policies in place where employees must comply with. And if certain information is needed to be shared with a third party, then there could be confidentiality clauses that will prevent the third party from sharing the information of the company, of the employees, or of the company's clients. So it is very important that you find a system in which you can be able to protect the integrity of the documents and information that are of high importance to you. To summarize what we have gone through, we looked at an exporter and what is required to become an exporter as well as the permit applications. We looked at a simple global supply chain model. We looked at a freight forwarder, their role, where you can be able to get a reputable list of freight forwarders, how you can go about choosing the freight forwarder. We briefly looked at the export cycle and then we went into details with the different processes that are part of that cycle. We looked at Incoterms, what they are, where they are established, and the role that they play when it comes to defining who is responsible to what at the different stages in the shipment. We also looked at international trade compliance as well as document confidentiality when it comes to how you protect the trade secrets of your company, the important or sensitive information of your employees, your company, or your clients. We then looked at the different ways in which goods can be transported, in highlighting also the fact that your decision on the way you are going to transport your goods is dependent on a number of factors. You will look at the cost, you will look at timing issues, you will also look at the advantages and the disadvantages. We also then looked at the measures and control bodies that are available where you can be able to apply for particular export permits. And remember, it is not all control bodies that will be affected, that will affect or influence your exporting transaction. However, the control bodies will have an effect or impact based on the type of goods or product you are looking at exporting. For any questions or inquiries about the training session we've just had, kindly send an email and on the subject line indicate the name of the training. The email address is onlinetrainingfeedback@seda.org.za. There are other awareness presentation trainings available. We have basic customer service awareness training, basic bookkeeping awareness training, basic business skills awareness training, basic quality management system awareness training, basic food hygiene awareness training, and basic business planning awareness training. However, for other Seda services, you can go to the website www.seda.org.za. Thank you for taking time going over this recording. I trust and hope that the information shared has been useful and beneficial to you and your company. Thank you.